Some of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about this morning has already been covered this weekend, particularly Dr. Lumiere Hamush, who is one of the connoisseurs of the endocannabinoid system, working with some of the most cutting-edge scientists in Israel, Raphael Meshulam and so on. So if you know about the endocannabinoid system, you may recognize these names. The interesting thing that I've personally, I found about the endocannabinoid system when I first started investigating or getting interested into this system about 3 years ago. This was still a rather obscure area of knowledge in science. I mean, the discovery of these receptors in the brain, it was only done in the early 90s, but over the last 3 years, this has been, there has been a huge explosion of understanding and new knowledge and our understanding of the system, to the point that now even National Geographic magazine has this all splatter over the front cover. So quite promising, I think, an area of study. So this is the result of a work that I've been carrying out for the last couple of years, which culminated in a dissertation for a master's degree in osteopathy. I am a recently qualified osteopath, but I'm also a physical therapist. I primarily work with rehabilitation and yoga. I've been doing this for the last 20 years. So I'm very interested in the physiology connected with the body, using the body as the primary tool for activating what is already inherent internally within our body. The idea is really very simple. What I'm proposing this morning is the use of osteopathic manual therapy. We can call it manual therapy for short, to activate, to stimulate the endocannabinoid system. In this particular case, the investigation was directed towards using this as a potential therapeutic tool for the management of patients suffering with Alzheimer's disease. But I believe that this could be used as well for any kind of neurodegenerative disorder. A little bit about osteopathy first. Osteopathy is a healthcare profession that emerges in North America in the late 19th century, mid to 19th century. The main proponent of this discipline was a man called Andrew Taylor Still, the guy here on the left, a radical thinker, radical physician, which proposes this new idea of therapy as in response to the status quo of the allopathic approach at the end of the 19th century. Still quite barbaric in terms of the type of therapeutic approaches that were used at that time. The man on the left was a British counterpart, another osteopath, Dr. Littlejohn, who was perhaps we owe him the introduction of osteopathy into the UK. Osteopathy is a regulated profession. We are overseen by the General Osteopathic Council, which is a kind of equivalent to the British Medical Council. Osteopaths undergo rigorous training in medical sciences, particularly focusing on anatomy, physiology, and everything that surrounds the pathophysiologists and so on. And we use manual therapy approaches, so soft tissue massage or articulation of the body, a manipulation of the vertebra and so on, very much like chiropractics. I imagine that perhaps the reason that you're here this morning is because you either are interested in manual therapy or you may be a therapist yourself, so you probably know about this already. Alzheimer's disease is a type of dementia. It's possibly the most common form of dementia. About 60% of the people diagnosed with a dementia condition has Alzheimer's disease. It's a progressive, irreversible disorder that impairs memory and thinking skills in the early stages and eventually leads to complete cognitive failure and death. There is about 44 million people affected with the condition worldwide, and there is about 1 million people of those who live here in the UK who have been actually diagnosed. The cost of caring for patients suffering with Alzheimer's disease is over £26 billion a year in the UK alone. And even though scientific research and medical science continues to work ferociously in an attempt to find a cure for the condition, currently there is no cure, only ways to manage the condition. So I'll try not to bore you too much with the technical stuff, but to really understand where I'm coming from, what the angle is, and what I'm proposing, we have to go a little bit deep into the brain and look at the mechanisms behind the pathophysiology of Alzheimer's disease and how the endocannabinoid system may integrate into these and potentially be helpful for the management of the condition. This is just an schematic representation of neurons in the brain, healthy neurons in the brain. There is about 100 billion neurons in your brain, and which produce about 300 trillion connections. So we're talking about, you think the internet is an amazing thing, look at this. So we're particularly interested in focusing on the synaptic junctions. That is the area where one neuron connects with another one, and where the transfer of information occurs. And this information, of course, is regulated by neurotransmitters, it's chemical messengers. The hallmark signs of Alzheimer's disease, you're probably familiar with this, is the formation of these plaques in the brain and the formation of neurofibrillary tangles within the neurons. These plaques are formed by a protein called amyloid beta. Amyloid beta is it's cleaved from a precursor protein that is embedded in the cell membrane. And it is important to understand that amyloid beta is a protein that is normally produced in all brains, in healthy brains. Everybody produces amyloid beta. It's necessary for the proper functioning of the brain and the functioning of the neurons. But in Alzheimer's disease, what occurs is that there's a dysfunction of the production of amyloid beta. There's an overproduction of amyloid beta. And generally what happens is this protein begins to clump and begins to form these plaques. The plaques then surround the axons of the neurons, and more importantly, they begin to block the synaptic junctions between one cell and the other. Now, for many years, researchers studying Alzheimer's disease always equated the formation of the plaque with the disease itself. It was always thought that the reason why people began to lose the mental faculties was because as the plaque amounts increase, the people began to lose their memory and thinking skills and so on. But recent research suggests that it's in fact a step before the formation of the plaque that is actually the main cause of the disruption in the messaging system between the neurons. And it is in fact the soluble form of amyloid beta which causes the disruption in the synapse. There is a buildup of this protein which tends to congregate in the synapse, and the brain, rather cleverly, has found a way, it's a sort of immune system mechanism to try to contain the elevated levels of this amyloid beta in the brain. The brain begins to create these plaques, so as a kind of sort of reservoirs of the excess amyloid beta, and therefore it forms these plaques. Of course, over time the brain is unable to cope with the formation of the plaque, and it increases and so on, and then it forms part of worsening the condition. This is just an image of what plaque looks like under the microscope. This is sort of rather ugly, sticky substance. The second element associated with Alzheimer's disease is the formation of these neurofibrillary tangles. this occurs while the plaque and the amyloid beta occurs extracellularly outside of the neuron. The neurofibrillary tangles occur within the cell, and it's as the result of the breakdown of these little structures here called microtubules. These microtubules are a sort of scaffolding system that maintain the integrity of the neuron in the brain. These microtubules are held together by tau protein. Because of a chemical process that occur as the condition develops, something called hyperphosphorylation, these microtubules begin to disintegrate, they begin to degrade, and the tau protein that keeps the integrity of the tubule begins to separate, and then it forms these fibrillary tangles within the cell. And this sort of Jackson Pollock looking thing is what those tangles look like in the cell. So this leads, of course, to an eventual loss of communication and general degeneration in the brain, and therefore it becomes a kind of this, as I said, the hallmark sign of what Alzheimer's disease is. Now, the main although these are the physiological components of the condition, what this causes is a chronic state of inflammation in the brain. I mean, there are various theories of why and how Alzheimer's disease occurs, but chronic inflammation seems to be a common feature in all people suffering from Alzheimer's disease, and this is where I believe the endocannabinoid system has a very important role to play. This inflammation is led by a whole series, a cascade of events linking all sorts of pro-inflammatory mediators, including free radicals, nitric oxide, cytokines, all sorts of things that maintain a constant state of inflammation. Inflammation is a normal mechanism, a healing mechanism in our bodies. We need inflammation. These are the initial stages for the healing processes that occur within the body. When you cut yourself, you hurt yourself, you hurt your ankle, the ankle goes into an inflammatory response. There is an inflammatory process, and that's how the healing process, the healing mechanism begins. In the brain, because we have this, certainly in Alzheimer's disease, because we have this sort of this constant positive feedback loop where there is formation of these plaque and tangles. The brain, in an attempt to try to generate a kind of healing mechanism, goes into a state of inflammation. But it sort of it keeps feeding itself, and then eventually leads to. That's why people diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease has, their prognosis is so poor. Depends on how advanced the condition, you may live between 5 and 7 years after diagnosis. So, the endocannabinoid system, the main role of the endocannabinoid system is regulation of the homeostasis or balance in the whole body. The most extraordinary thing about this system in our body is that it's completely disseminated throughout the body. I'll keep it simple. So we can summarize the endocannabinoid system as relax, eat, and sleep. All common conditions, if you are familiar with the exogenous kind of cannabinoid, and you've ever perhaps smoked and not inhaled, you still will have perceived that these are some of the effects that are associated with cannabinoids. But most importantly, the endocannabinoid system is there to offer protection. Endocannabinoids have extraordinary properties as anti-inflammatory and neuroprotective, and as I said, are associated with many mechanisms in the whole body. In a nutshell, the endocannabinoid system is composed of cell receptors. The endocannabinoids themselves, I'm sorry about that sort of seem to have changed in the. So the endocannabinoids themselves, which are the ligands or the chemicals themselves, and the metabolizing enzymes. These metabolizing enzymes are there to degrade the endocannabinoid once it's not needed anymore. So, as I said, endocannabinoid receptors were discovered in the early 90s. The most commonly known, sorry, not endocannabinoids, the receptors themselves, the most common receptors and the ones that we concentrate the most on in try to understand are CB1 and CB2. That stands for cannabinoid 1 and cannabinoid 2. Cannabinoid receptor 1 was the first one to be isolated in the early 90s, and it's primarily associated with the central nervous systems. There's a huge amount of these cannabinoid receptors in your brain and in your spinal cord. And cannabinoid receptor 2 was isolated a couple of years later, and it was primarily associated with immune system cells. There's a huge amount of these cannabinoid receptors in your digestive tract, for example, and in organs associated with your immune system, like your liver, for example. But not long ago, the CB2 receptors were finally identified in the brain. They are expressed by a type of neural cell called the microglia. And microglia, the primary function of the microglia is the cleaners. You know, they are there to try to put things right. If there are things going dysfunctional, for example, microglia tend to get activated ferociously once in the Alzheimer's condition because of this, all this plaque and foreign substances that accumulate. Now, what is important to me and to all of you who may have an interest in manual therapy is the recent discovery, really very recent discovery of cannabinoid receptors in muscle and skin cells, in what we call myofibroblast or synoviocytes. And the reason for that is, of course, as a manual therapist, your only contact with a patient is through their skin, through their body. That's how we, that's a sort of a power as therapists is through that manual contact. Why is this important? Generally, all receptors in the body, anything that has to do with the chemistry of the receptors, I think as Dr. Lumiere explained yesterday, these receptors are like locks, or they're like they're like a puzzle, and the chemicals that attach to those receptors are like a key that open that lock, or they are like a puzzle piece that fits together, that allows the receptor to activate, and therefore you get all the benefits from this activation. But there is a couple of studies that have recently suggested that receptors, in this case cannabinoid receptors, can actually be activated through a process called a constitutive activity, which means through applying torsional forces in muscle and skin cells, it is actually possible to activate the receptor without its corresponding ligand. And this is what is extraordinary about this, certainly for me, because it offers a real possibility for the proposal as being true or good. In these two images, you can see in the left side, this is a PET scan of a Alzheimer's disease brain. The areas shaded in red and yellow demonstrate a massive amount of a buildup of this amyloid plaque. And the image on the right shows the location, also shaded in red and yellow. This is, of course, two different people, of the location of the cannabinoid receptors. So as you can see, you can make a sort of type of close correlation between what occurs in the brain, the areas of the brain that get affected, which are primarily your cerebral cortex or the hypothalamus, which are areas that are highly concentrated in cannabinoid receptors. There is a kind of proposal. It's an assertion that is yet to be proven. Thank you. That there's a type of practice in osteopathy called cranial osteopathy, where you use various techniques, apply various different types of pressure in the cranium to try and manipulate the sutures in your cranium and so on. There is, there's a whole philosophy, ideology behind it and how it works. But certainly, the idea that the receptors can actually be activated through compression or pressure suggests the possibility. There is an area in the brain, your cerebral ventricles, that are highly loaded with CB1 receptors, and the periaqueductal gray, which is an area within the the cerebral ventricles. And the suggestion is that by applying a certain amount of pressure to the base of the cranium, one can raise the hydrostatic pressure of the cerebrospinal fluid and in that way cause an effect on the cannabinoid receptor and activate it. Again, this is only a hypothesis and it hasn't been proven yet, very difficult to do, but it could make sense because mechanisms like this occur in other areas of the body, for example, in your digestive tract, where angiotensin receptors are activated through, like I said, hydrostatic pressures without the use of the coupling of the angiotensin ligand to the receptor. So it's just making associations here from one to the other. Now, these two guys, they are the endocannabinoids themselves. You probably are very familiar with them by now. Anandamide and 2-arachidonyl glycerol, or 2-AG for short. These guys are the sort of rock stars of the endocannabinoid world. They were initially identified again just shortly after the cannabinoid receptors were found, but we now have, this list has now extended. There are several other endocannabinoids that have been identified in the body, such as virodamine or noladin ether and so on. They all have very different functions. To me, these two guys are like the Cheech and Chong of the endocannabinoid world. Really, they are the chemicals that make you feel all nice and cozy and warm and give you those nice feelings of well-being. Certainly, you probably come across already this idea of what they call the runner's high, which is a feeling of well-being that sports people experience after intense training, particularly associated with runners. For many years, this was associated to the increase of endorphins and enkephalins in the body, in the brain. But endorphins are opioid-based chemicals, and so there was really no way to justify some of the anecdotal tales that the people report about this sort of feeling high and well and kind of relaxed, basically high, as if you're stoned when you run, and associated with an opioid. Opioids tend to be depressants, and so when the endocannabinoid system was discovered, then immediately a connection, a sort of a relationship there was created, and the suggestion is now that you feel so good, for example, when you do a good strong yoga session and afterwards you feel like you're floating and in heaven and you think that you're sort of becoming the one with the light and all of that. Well, I think that really has to do with the increase in your levels of circulating endocannabinoids in the body. These little guys are so radical that they even go against the flow. Most neurotransmitters go from your presynaptic cell, so this is the synaptic junction, like I said before. They move from one neuron to the next in this direction. Endocannabinoids do it the other way around. They are synthesized in the postsynaptic cell and then they are released into the synapse where they then coupled with the corresponding cannabinoid receptor, and that triggers a whole reaction that that has extensive results. But the important thing to understand here is that what we attempt is to try to increase the levels of the naturally occurring cannabinoids in your body as a therapeutic thank you. As a therapeutic option to the idea that we need to ingest all the time exogenous drugs. We of course, this is a conference about drugs. I'm all about that. But I also believe in the idea that the body contains, and this is one of the principal tenets of osteopathy, of course, it's not my idea, the body contains all the necessary elements that you need for maintaining health. If we're able to somehow target those elements in a body and able to manipulate them in a positive way, we can self-medicate and self-regulate ourselves without the risk of ever overdosing. Your body's never going to produce extra, anandamide and to cause you damage. So this is where I begin to put all these things together. So our current understanding of Alzheimer's disease related to endocannabinoid system is that we know there is a strong correlation between an elevation of amyloid beta peptide in the brain and a decrease in anandamide, which is the natural neuroprotectant for neurons. We know that these two endocannabinoids reduce the expression of these inflammatory mediators in the brain, so they are anti-inflammatory. Most of these studies, of course, have been carried out on, either in rats or in vitro, but there is there's strong evidence that this is the case. And we know that anandamide and 2-AG protect the neurons against the amyloid beta cell death by decreasing the breakdown of DNA in the cell nucleus. This is some of the ways in which endocannabinoids interact with Alzheimer's disease. Up to date, there's only 2 studies have been carried out in relation of manual therapy and their effects on the endocannabinoid system. It's not surprising, of course, that there's no more than just 2 studies. I mean, that one is 10 years old, that one is 8 years old. And of course, it's not surprising because there's no money to be made in this. There is no pharmacology, there's no medication, there's nothing to be made, so the pharmaceutical companies are not interested in developing this sort of stuff. And nonetheless, I think there is value in exploring these therapeutic possibilities for many fields in medicine. That particular study was conducted in New Zealand. The subjects were exposed to manual treatment for 20 minutes. Blood was taken before and after the manual treatment was given, and the results were staggering. The subjects which were, the study was conducted against sham manipulation. The subjects that received manual therapy had a 168% increase in circulating levels of endocannabinoids in the blood compared to the sham subjects which had absolutely no change in the circulating levels of endocannabinoids. So again, another idea to support this idea that manual therapy and physical activity increase your levels of endocannabinoids. So the economic and psychosocial cost of this condition is enormous. We know there is no cure, and therefore we need to find ways to reduce the risk or delay the onset of this condition. We know that cannabinoid signaling decreases in the presence of disease and aging in general. The experimental evidence is there to show that the endocannabinoid system is an important component of the neuroprotective and anti-inflammatory aspects of our chemistry in the brain. And we now determine as well the osteopathic manual therapy, or manual therapy in general, induces compressive forces in your musculoskeletal system that is actually able to activate your endocannabinoid system. So in light of all of this information, I believe that we should leave no left turn on stone. Thank you.